From the very start, Edgar Allan Poe's life was dramatic and confused. He was born in Boston in January 1809, the second child of actors David and Elizabeth Poe. Elizabeth Poe was the daughter of an actress called Mrs. Arnold, who had apparently learned her craft in the Theatre Royal, Covent Garden in London, for so she was advertised. When Elizabeth arrived from England, she was 9 years old. Her mother teamed up with a man called Tubbs, and soon the young Elizabeth took part in their productions. As she grew older and her beauty and talent matured, she became the star of various companies up and down the eastern seaboard. She married another actor, Mr. Hopkins, in 1802. He died in 1805, and almost at once she married another actor, David Poe. David Poe had begun his adult life as a law student, but gave up his studies to go on the stage. Whether his talent merited the move is hard to say, but the family certainly was very poor. We know little more of David Poe, except that he disappeared in 1810. Either he died, or he ran off with another woman. Elizabeth Poe was left in Boston with 2 children, and expecting a third. The eldest boy, William, was adopted by relatives, but taking Edgar along, she went on working as and where she could, up and down the country. Apart from the difficulties of her pregnancy, she was already suffering from tuberculosis. While working in Norfolk, Virginia, she gave birth to her daughter Rosalie, and had to go on working to support the 2 children. Her last engagement was in the town of Richmond, Virginia, with its splendid state capitol building designed by Thomas Jefferson. Not far away, in these simple buildings no longer standing, Elizabeth Poe lodged for a time, and died at the beginning of December 1811. Fortunately, she was not without friends who were concerned about the plight of her children. She was buried in the churchyard of St. John in the upper part of the old town, and 2 women immediately agreed to adopt the children. Edgar went with a Mrs. Frances Allan, and Rosalie with Mrs. Allan's friend, Mrs. Mackenzie. It was a lucky chance for the 2 children, for the families were well off and well able to care for them. Frances Allan was then 25, married for 8 years, and childless. It is not hard to believe that she was delighted to adopt the attractive, curly-haired little boy Edgar. She was a good woman, and her husband a prosperous merchant who owned a part share in a large store in the town. So for Edgar Poe it was a wonderful stroke of luck. John Allan was a Scotsman who had arrived in Virginia about 1795 at the age of 15 to work as a clerk for his uncle William Galt, a leading merchant of the city. With Galt's help, Allan eventually set up as a merchant with a friend, Charles Ellis. Their business, a general store, pictured here in later years, but also a substantial tobacco exporting operation, prospered. At first the family lived over the shop. Richmond at this time was a thriving, stable community with fine churches, like the one in whose yard Elizabeth Poe was buried, and an increasingly prosperous middle class setting itself up well in houses like these. The Allans went to this church, known as the Memorial Church. It was built to commemorate the death of nearly 90 people who died when the theatre, which used to occupy the spot, was burned down. This happened only a few weeks after Elizabeth Poe's death, and of course she had often acted in the theatre. Poe later remembered the rather overbearing preacher pictured in this silhouette, and the pleasing elegance of the social life surrounding the church. Enjoying its status as a seat of government, Richmond had good schools, and to these the little boy was sent by his foster parents, Mr. and Mrs. Allan. Allan had plans to expand his business in London, and taking his family along with him, he sailed for England in 1815 when Poe was about 6 years old. On arrival in Liverpool, they went north to Scotland to visit Allan's relatives. They were well received, and an attempt was made to settle Edgar into school in Irvine, where the Allan relatives lived. Although he had a young cousin to study with, when his stepmother went south to London, he wanted to be there too. So after about a couple of months' schooling in Scotland, he went to London. They settled in Bloomsbury, in comfortable lodgings, but the London of 1815, with the Napoleonic Wars just over, was an expensive place, and Allan's business affairs did not prosper. However, he sent Edgar to the best schools he could find, including one in the little village of Stoke Newington, to the north of the city. In the Manor House School, Edgar did well, and his foster father seemed pleased and ready to spend the considerable sums Edgar's schooling required. Back in Richmond in 1820, after the failure of his English ventures, Allan was almost bankrupt. With the help of his uncle Galt, he survived. For Edgar, it was the best time of his life. He grew up in every respect. He became an excellent swimmer, for example, here in the James River, pictured today a mile or two above the town. Such huge rivers are common in the United States, but even more astonishing are the massive tracts of land crowding the shores, which are quite undeveloped, even today. But in the Richmond of Poe's youth, the sophisticated and charming Southern society was developing apace, and Edgar Allan Poe fitted right into it. Jane Stannard, the beautiful mother of one of his school friends, lived in the large house pictured here at the back of the Capitol building. Poe developed a passion for her, and when she suddenly died in 1824, he was devastated. She inspired one of his best-known poems, written in later years, to Helen. He was already at 15, precocious and reading and writing poetry. Poe was much loved by his foster mother, Frances Allan. He was still sent to the best of schools, mixing with the best of society, in spite of his stepfather's considerable financial difficulties. However, his relationship with John Allan was never an easy one. Allan never formally adopted him, in spite of his bringing the boy up in the heart of his household. It was always assumed by the outside world that Allan looked on Edgar as his son and heir. A school friend later wrote, "Mr. Allan was a good man in his way, but Edgar was not fond of him. Often, when angry with Edgar, he would threaten to turn him adrift. He never allowed Edgar to lose sight of his dependence on his charity." Allan was a meticulous person, and kept all his correspondence. In one astonishing and revealing letter at this time to Poe's brother in Baltimore, he says of the young Edgar, "The boy possesses not a spark of affection for us, not a particle of gratitude for all my care and kindness towards him." It was a harsh judgment, but it makes what followed in their relationship easier to understand. Of Poe's character, his boyhood friend Thomas Sully later wrote, "He would never allow the big boys to tease me, and was kind to me in every way. I used to admire and envy him. He was so bright and clever and handsome." Another friend, Tom Ellis, wrote, "There was not a brighter, more graceful boy in the city than Edgar Allan Poe." How did John Allan get it so wrong about his foster son? Whatever the reason, when Edgar was 15, John Allan succeeded to his uncle Galt's fortune, making him one of the first citizens of the town. The rise to riches did not improve his relationship with his foster son. Allan bought this house and the prestige that went with it. Across the road lived Elmira Roysten, 15 years old, beautiful, and as it turned out, sensitive and intelligent. Within months, she and Poe had unofficially become engaged to each other, and in later years Elmira confirmed the depth of their feelings. Meanwhile, John Allan had developed good reasons for getting rid of Edgar. Allan had an illegitimate son by a former mistress, and more children by another woman. It is very likely that in a tight society like Richmond, Edgar had learned about these liaisons, and he would undoubtedly have been hurt on his stepmother's behalf, and all too ready to accuse Allan face to face. In his newfound eminence, Allan could not afford a scandal with his wife, and as Poe was devoted to Frances and full of ideals about honour, he could not easily be kept quiet. He had to be got rid of. Virginia, in the early 19th century, was very much at the heart of the new United States, having produced no less than 3 out of the first 4 presidents. Early in 1825, one of these, Thomas Jefferson, realized his dream of establishing a new university for Virginia, and in the buildings he designed, teaching began. In 1826, Edgar Allan Poe joined the new intake of 177 students. He was 17 and bent on being a professional writer. This idea did not go down well with the pleasure-loving young Virginian gentlemen by whom he was surrounded. Art was all very well, but it wasn't work for a gentleman. It was also entirely at odds with what John Allan wanted of him, if by now he wanted anything. Students were housed in the hotels that lined the green in front of the rotunda. Professors occupied the delightful pillared houses in between, and much thought was given as to how the university should be run. Poe eventually settled in this room in the block known as West Range. Here Poe studied and struggled with the problems which began to beset him. From the very first week he got into debt because the money John Allan had given him was not enough to cover the initial expenses of the school. But as Allan's son, he got credit easily enough. When Allan did not send more money, Poe gambled, as everyone else did, and ran up more debts. Not doubting that Allan would pay in the end, he spent freely on clothes and entertainments, and before long he was head over heels in difficulties. It was from this time that he had a reputation for being a drunkard, something that dogged him for the rest of his life. It seems that in fact very little alcohol produced in him disastrous effects. At the end of his first year, Allan brought him home, paid the most pressing bills, and more or less made it clear that from then on Poe would have to fend for himself. It was a dreadful predicament for the young man, until now used to comfort and even luxury, and the expectation that they would continue. Of course, part of Allan's plan to discredit Poe had included breaking off relations with Elmira. All his letters to her were intercepted. When her parents were told Poe would not inherit Allan's wealth, they arranged for her to marry another man a few months later. Having left home and got somehow to Boston, in desperation he joined the army as Private Perry. Within months his good qualities had been recognized, and he was doing well. It is strange to find the would-be romantic poet in so fundamentally unpoetic an organization as the army. However, even as Private Perry, he had pursued his poetic ambitions, and had his first book of poems published in 1827, Tamerlane and Other Poems, and it established one of the most remarkable elements of Poe's character, namely that no matter how he was buffeted about by life, he kept on writing, carefully and well. He was, in fact, the true professional when it came to the work he cared about. His army career was successful to such an extent that he was accepted at West Point Military Academy as an officer cadet, this time under his own name, and with some signs of support from Allan, whom he continued to write to, asking for help. West Point sits high on the banks of the Hudson River, 50 miles north of New York, and is the training ground for the officer elite of the U.S. Army. At West Point, Poe did surprisingly well at first. At study, on parade, and even when it came to discipline, Poe seemed to cope and almost to thrive. But his past was still hanging over him. His foster mother and his greatest ally, Frances Allan, had died. Surprisingly, John Allan, feeling perhaps that the army was not such a bad way to keep him out of Richmond, had sent some money to help him. Poe had felt encouraged. Poe might well have continued to enjoy Allan's support at West Point, but he had unfortunately written a letter to an earlier creditor, in which he had described John Allan as not very often sober. This letter had reached Allan, who was about to remarry. In a fury he broke off all connection with Poe, who then determined to have himself thrown out of the army. A few drinks too many, and a few rules broken, and it was done. In February 1831 he was dismissed from West Point. But a second edition of his poems was being published in New York, 124 pages, paid for by the subscriptions of his fellow students at the Academy. Something must have gone right there. But New York was not the place for him. Poe's life took a new twist. He turned to his surviving Poe relatives in Baltimore. With them he was to live in the little house in Amity Street and establish his reputation as a writer and editor. In Baltimore things all turned around this woman, Maria Clem, younger sister of Poe's father, David Poe. She had been widowed at 36 and left with 2 children, so with Poe's grandmother and sick brother to care for, and now Edgar, she had a lot to cope with. By 1832 he had managed to get a few stories published in local papers, and it began to be accepted that Eddie had a career as a writer and would eventually make it. He won small prizes for poetry and stories run by local magazines. It was not much, but it was encouragement of sorts. Allan had meanwhile died, and of course left him nothing. Poe moved to Richmond to take up a job as assistant editor of a magazine called The Messenger. This was a step up the ladder, but his progress was affected by a further dimension in his life. In Baltimore he had lived with Maria Clem and her little daughter Virginia for 6 years. When he left, Virginia was 12 years old. He had already set his heart on eventually marrying her. In Richmond, Poe was told by letter that Virginia was to go to live with a cousin, Nielsen Poe, and his wife. There she would be looked after and educated. It seemed that the rest of the family were out to protect her from him. Poe wrote to Mrs. Clem, "The tone of your letter wounds me to the soul. Oh, auntie, auntie, you loved me once. How can you be so cruel now? You speak of Virginia acquiring accomplishments and entering into society. You speak in so worldly a tone. Are you sure she will be more happy? Do you think anyone could love her more dearly than I? My dear auntie, I cannot advise you. Ask Virginia. Leave it to her. Let me have, under her own hand, a letter bidding me good-bye for ever. And I may die. My heart will break, but I will say no more." For Virginia he added, "My love, my own sweetest sissy, my darling little wifey, think well before you break the heart of your cousin Eddie." It may all be a bit pathetic, but Virginia listened all the same. At the Messenger all was not well. Poe was sacked for being drunk in the morning. There is evidence to suggest that in fact Poe had an illness such as diabetes, from which he eventually died, and which would be severely aggravated by alcohol. If this is so, it goes a long way to explain his erratic behaviour. However, he sorted things out with his employer on the Messenger, and soon Mrs. Clem, Virginia, and Poe were settled in a house on Capitol Square in Richmond. The Messenger, though not paying much, allowed him scope to make his name, and under his editorship circulation rose from 500 a month to 3,500 a month. On May 16, 1836, Poe and Virginia were married. She was 13 and Poe 27, and a bit of arm-twisting must have been done to persuade the preacher that she was legally old enough. But Virginia proved to be the mate Poe needed, and he loved her to the end of her short life. The Messenger, under Poe's guidance, had quickly come to be recognized as one of the best magazines in the States, but it had gone way ahead of its owner, and he dismissed Poe in January 1837. The break was amicable, and anyway it was time to move on to more demanding pastures. They settled in Greenwich Village in New York, and Mrs. Clem started a boarding house to help pay the bills. It did well, and Edgar worked hard at his writing. He took the short story to new heights and produced a level of work never seen in America before. The narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym was written at this time. They moved next to Philadelphia, and in this house some of his best stories were written. He got no more than $10 each for them, however, until finally, in Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, 25 stories came out in one volume. It hardly sold, and the future looked grim. Poe had always wanted to start a magazine of his own, and he drew up a prospectus for one to be called The Pen. His proposals were of course excellent because he knew what he was talking about. A continuous, definite character and a marked certainty of purpose are requisites of vital importance. But he also wanted a criticism self-sustained, guiding itself only by the purest rules of art. Although he put together a good subscription list, the Pen never got off the ground. He was aiming too high, and it was certainly a bad time to start a business. Someone who read the prospectus, however, was a young man called George Graham, an assistant editor of the Saturday Evening Post. He wanted a quality magazine, and in 1840 bought one called The Gentleman's. It had a circulation of 5,000 per month. He offered the editorship of Graham's Ladies and Gentlemen's Magazine, as he called it, to Poe, so the family circumstances changed dramatically. Poe now had a reasonable salary and a chance to work as he wanted under a sympathetic owner. Circulation rose to 25,000 a month by the end of 1841. In this house Poe enjoyed perhaps the most stable and agreeable period of his life. They entertained, Virginia played and sang to their guests, and Poe came to quickly occupy a real position of respect among the literary people of Philadelphia. Poe was not making a lot of money, but he was stable, and in this period he wrote some of his best criticism and stories. He met Dickens, who was visiting Philadelphia, and obviously impressed him, as the novelist later made efforts to get Poe's work published in England. Sadly, this stability of Philadelphia did not last long. In the midst of his success, Virginia fell ill with consumption and very nearly died. This set him drinking again, and by 1842 he had lost his job and began spiraling down, drinking, offending people, being his usual oversensitive self. He went to New York. There, Mrs. Clem helped him to get a job as sub-editor on the Evening Mirror, and there once again he had a regular income. He did have a real reputation by this time, so publishers and editors were ready to buy what he wrote. Around this time Poe wrote The Raven, his best-known poem, published in the Mirror on 29th January. It was a sensation, and he became a celebrity. He moved to be joint editor of the Broadway Journal, and everything might have at last gone well for Edgar Allan Poe. But as a large part of his work was literary criticism, and he was never afraid to speak the truth as he saw it, he was soon in hot water, boldly criticizing other writers and drawing their wrath upon himself. However, by sheer chance, the Broadway Journal, increasingly successful under its new editor, was in fact in financial trouble, and the owner sold it to Poe for $50, payable in December of that year, 1845. At last, it seemed, he had his own journal. But come December, unbelievably, he did not have the money to pay, and he lost it. Once again out of work, and living in this little cottage at Fordham, outside New York to the north, Poe, Virginia, and Mrs. Clem struggled. It was too much for Virginia, and she died on 30th January 1847. Poe was left with only Mrs. Clem to care for him and the problems he constantly brought upon himself. It is an indication of how quickly Poe's reputation rose over the 19th century that this house, like several others he lived in across the country, is carefully preserved for posterity in a New York park, and open as a museum celebrating his work. Poe was still a celebrity, if a broken one, and of course he also presented a very attractive personality to the world. One of the unusual results of this was that he was often pursued by women, eager to have him praise their literary efforts. However, quite distracted by Virginia's death, he set off unaccountably on a journey to Philadelphia and Baltimore. On it he appears to have begun drinking, he who could not take even a small amount of alcohol without being severely affected by it. He somehow got to Richmond, and met again, of all people, Elmira Roysten, his boyhood sweetheart, and now a rich widow. He certainly wanted to marry her, but before it went any further he abruptly left town. He was next found lying in a street in Baltimore, suffering from an illness never quite defined, which within a few days had killed him. Mysteriously, he was not wearing his own clothes. Mrs. Clem read of his death in the newspapers. His end has some of the mysterious qualities of his own stories, which are the best guide to his character. In Edgar Allan Poe, America had its first truly great imaginative writer. In his own genre of horror and suspense he remains unmatched, and in his professionalism and high artistic goals against all odds, he set standards which are his own best memorial.